Good morning, everyone. My name is Ellen Laipson, and it's really a great privilege to participate in this program celebrating the extraordinary career and the great wisdom of Walter Laqueur. I'm really very happy to be part of this event, and I have the honor of chairing the second panel, which continues to consider Walter's remarkable range of intellectual interests. And in this panel, we'll consider some of the other isms of the 20th century that he and other scholars here at the panel have worked on. I'm going to quickly introduce each of our speakers, and each of the speakers will have about 12 to 14 minutes. There'll be time for us to talk, and if everyone behaves at 12:30, we'll actually start to hear from Walter. He'll make some remarks at the close of this panel. Our first speaker is Jehuda Reinharz, who is the president of the Mandel Foundation and a professor of modern Jewish history at Brandeis. His affiliation with Brandeis goes back several decades and includes both professor, director of the Tauber Institute, provost and senior vice president, and in 1994 he became the 7th president of Brandeis. Since January of this year, he's been the president of the Mandel Foundation. His own works include the biography of Chaim Weizmann and co-authored with Ben Halpern, Zionism and the Creation of a New Society. Our second speaker will be Professor Abraham Ascher, who is currently a distinguished professor emeritus, having retired from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He's published a number of books, The Revolution of 1905, and The Search for Stability, that was published in 2000 by Stanford University Press. Also, The Jews of Breslau Under Nazism, which will link to one of the themes of today's panel. Our third speaker is Professor Bruce Hoffman. He's been studying terrorism and insurgency for more than 30 years. He's currently a professor at Georgetown University. He previously held the corporate chair in counterterrorism and counterinsurgency at the Rand Corporation. 2004-2005, he was an advisor on counterinsurgency to the Coalition Provisional Authority in Baghdad. He holds degrees in government history and international relations and has a doctorate from Oxford. And our last speaker is Yoav Karny, a veteran Israeli journalist, author of a seminal book on the disintegration of the post-Soviet Caucasus, and presently an international affairs columnist for the Israeli newspaper Globs. So I welcome our first speaker to the podium. We're going to ask you to speak from here, if you don't mind. And when you're about 2 minutes out from the end, I'll give you a little warning. Okay? Thank you.
Good morning. Happy birthday, Walter. Zionism is one of the national movements which captured Walter Laqueur's imagination. When he wrote his history of Zionism in the late 1960s, it was a daring enterprise. The last time such a synthetic work was attempted was in the 1930s by Adolf Böhm. This did not deter Walter, who in a period of 4 years mastered the subject in all of its intricacies. Owing to the anomalies of the Jewish position in the diaspora, Jewish ideologies since the 18th century Enlightenment had to redefine cultural, social, and economic, as well as purely political aims, and adapt a variety of strategies to accomplish them. This caused not only Zionism, but all of modern Jewish ideologies to assume a distinctly different character from comparable movements among other people. In his study, Walter Laqueur outlined a variety of competing ideologies within the Jewish world and within the Zionist movement in the context of European and Middle Eastern history. 40 years later, his book is still the standard work in courses in the United States and Israel and elsewhere, and has been translated into many languages. I'll stop here for a second just to say that luckily for me, Yoram, where's Yoram, Perry? Yoram is a wonderful organizer because he gave me total leeway as to what to do here this morning. And so I'm going to divert a little bit from what was done here this morning. There was a short discussion here this morning whether Walter published 124 books or 145. Does it really make a difference? I mean, none of us have read all of his books, and he writes faster than we can read anyhow. But the fact is that when it comes to the history of Zionism, Walter published one book, and the standard book in the field, and with many new editions and new prefaces and so forth. But it's really one book. So just go ahead and read the book. It's worthwhile rather than me repeating what the book is. But I decided to take this opportunity to really talk about the kind of background that Walter came from. And sort of, if you want, it's not actually biographical, but it's semi-biographical, because Walter was a member of the Werkleute in Breslau, which later, we had this debate last night, merged with the Hashomer HaTzair. And if you like, by some indirection, this is also somewhat biographical. And it talks about a slice of the German impact, or Western impact, on Zionism both in Central and Western Europe, as well as in Israel. On April 26, 1896, Theodor Herzl wrote to the Grand Duke Friedrich von Baden, "If it is God's will that we return to our historic fatherland, we would like to do so as representatives of Western civilization and bring cleanliness, order, and the well-distilled customs of the Occident to this plague-ridden, blighted corner of the Orient. We shall have to do this so as to be able to exist there, and this obligation will educate our people to the extent that they need it." Within Jewish literature, there was a preference for terms such as the Orient and the revival of the Orient because the word was not laden with negative connotations. In addition, there was a widespread fashion of positive Orientalism among German intellectual circles at the end of the 19th century. Therefore, the call to return to the Orient and the description of Arabs as, quote, "our brothers by blood, members of the Semitic tribes," attested to the fact that Zionism did not see itself as a colonialist movement attempting to instill its ancient native culture in a new and foreign place, but rather as a result of Jews' bitter disappointment with European culture. The appearance of this positive depiction of the Orient in Zionist discourse seems to express a rejection of the degenerate West, as well as a search for an old source of redemption that would inspire new, complete, and authentic Jewish experience, Jüdisches Wesen. In Buber's opinion, for example, only in Palestine could the Jewish people's primordial strength be renewed and expressed to its full extent. The utopian portrait of the Orient as a complete alternative to the West, and the belief that it could revive Europe, were borrowed primarily from the European counterculture that depicted the imaginary Orient as the absolute alternative to European culture and the European character with its bourgeois values. Since Europe was deeply mired in malaise, materialism, nihilism, decadence, and a Philistine bourgeois mentality, it was necessary to escape from it to distant lands, even imaginary ones. Martin Buber, who was, by the way, also one of the inspirations for the Werkleute, wrote that the way to salvation and rehabilitation for the Jewish collective I was to disconnect itself from Europe, which was sinking into a deep mire. Only then could Jews create an organic, rooted Judaism full of new strength. The utopian imaginary Orient and its sensory nature were thus perceived by Buber as a cure for the profound schism and fatal illness that modern Western culture inflicted upon Jewish experience. The cure to the ills of the mechanical, atrophying Western culture would be found only outside of Europe in the Orient. Only there could a complete and healthy, vital and creative Judaism be reborn. And only there, wrote the poet Uwe Zvi Greenberg, could the Jews, as an Oriental handful whom Europe has regarded as a low Semitic creatures, give expression to their identity as an organic and territorial racial group. For this reason, Greenberg extolled the pioneers who left behind all of Europe's splendor in order to be members of the cult of the barefoot and feverish in Palestine, as he called them. The myth of the Orient was one thing, reality another. Buber did not call on Germany's Jews to dissociate themselves from Europe. Moreover, he wrote that those who travel to live in Palestine among the Hebrew community will carry German spiritual assets in their very souls. That is, he did not call upon them to abandon the humanist tradition of the West, but simply to leave behind its dark side and the wild overgrowth it sprouted. Certainly, he did not ask them to leave behind every asset of that culture. A vision of the Middle East that underwent a profound process of Europeanization was also put forth by Hans Kohn, a Zionist activist who eventually became a fierce critic of Zionism and a well-known scholar of nationalism. From Jerusalem in 1934, he wrote that despite the fact that Europe was undergoing difficult crisis, the magic of Europe ensured that a process of Europeanization took place throughout every nation in the Middle East, albeit in varying degrees. The culture of Western Europe had become a universal culture, influencing thought throughout the world and celebrating its victory around the globe. Now members of the ancient cultures were stirring from the centuries-long sleep, and a new stage of human development was at hand. The Jewish migration from Europe to Palestine was generally perceived not as an act that would bring about a complete disengagement from Western culture, but as one that would enable Jewish culture to be reborn by choice. An immigrant may decide which cultural assets he carried with him to sow in the new land and which assets he relinquishes. He also is freed from the temptations and pressures of the surrounding foreign culture that he leaves. According to this perception, emigration to Palestine offered the Jews the only option for acculturation into European culture without a risk of assimilation and absorption, because it created the only possibility to selectively transfer Europe to Palestine. Such declarations of loyalty toward Europe also arrived from Jews who profoundly criticized European society and culture, and even described it as unhealthy. This represented an internal critique, not a delight in doomsaying or a bid for divorce. The sharpest critics of Western culture were unwilling to relinquish most of the European assets that European Jews had adopted throughout the 19th century. Even feelings of disappointment and disenchantment did not lead them to a conclusion that they must relinquish all of Europe's spiritual and cultural assets and uproot the Europeanness from the Jewish experience. For instance, in Avram Shmuel Hirschberg's report about his journey to Palestine in 1899-1900, he tallied the pianos, 10 in all, that he found in settlers' houses in Rishon LeZion, and wrote of one of the settlers of Petah Tikva, who was a native of his own city, Bialystok, quote, "In Bialystok, this family would have seen several generations pass by before arriving at such a high level of culture. Palestine has become a shortcut to European culture." Evidence of European education were the books Hirschberg found in the settlements' libraries, works by Émile Zola, Alphonse Daudet, as well as Russian novels. Hirschberg claimed that without the infusion of European material culture into Palestine, the Jewish settlers would not be able to rise above the backward Asiatic living conditions of the Arab inhabitants. In 1898, the teacher David Yudelevich expressed his pride in the books found in private homes in the settlements, including books by Ferdinand Lassalle, Charles Darwin, Victor Hugo, Ernest Renan, and Blaise Pascal, and British, German, Russian, and other classics, both in the original text and in translation. So the return to the Orient, that is to Palestine, was not meant to uproot Europeanness from the Jewish experience. The accepted opinion was that the Jews had become a European people and that in Palestine they intended to forge an amalgamation of Jewish and European culture. A stormy debate over this question erupted after the 1902 publication of Altneuland, Herzl's utopian novel. Ahad Ha'am wrote a venomous review of Altneuland in which he described Herzl's fictional Jewish society as blindly aping European culture. According to him, Herzl promised the Jews that they would achieve in Palestine what they were unable to achieve in Europe. Ahad Ha'am's primary criticism was aimed at what he saw as the absence of Jewish and Hebrew character. Ahad Ha'am's argument was justified to some extent. In the Jewish state, Herzl wished to reassure those who feared moving away from civilization. He declared that it was possible to transfer culture from its location and to plant it elsewhere. I quote, "There are English hotels in Egypt and on the mountain peaks of Switzerland, Vienna cafes in South Africa, French theaters in Russia, German operas in America, and the best Bavarian beer in Paris. When we depart from Egypt, once again, we shall not leave the flesh pots behind. In a similar spirit, Herzl wrote in his diary on June 7, 1895, that it would be necessary to supply the inhabitants of the Jewish state with mass entertainment, German theaters, international theaters, operas, operettas, circuses, concert cafes, and Café Champs-Élysées. The novel Altneuland is an ode to the utilization of European technology and science for the purpose of creating an advanced model of society. There's almost no sign in the novel of the presence of Jewish culture in the new Jewish society. European culture was in full reign. Ladies chat about the latest Parisian hats and order their clothes directly from the stores on the Rue de la Paix. In a party held by the painter Isaacs in his charming Jerusalem villa, this is all in the novel, which is full of rare treasures, his daughter Miriam sings songs by Schumann, Rubinstein, and Wagner, but not songs of Zion, and concludes with a lied from Goethe's novel Wilhelm Meister, Kennst du das Land, wo die Zitronen blühen? Knowest thou the land where the lemon trees bloom? Theater troupes from France and Italy appear in Haifa alongside popular comedies in Yiddish, the biblical play Moses, and the opera Shabtai Tzvi, but these are not, according to Herzl, the main part of the new Jewish culture. And finally, even Ben-Gurion, when speaking before the Zionist Congress in 1935, the 18th Zionist Congress, wrote the following: "We are returning to the Orient, but we bring the enlightenment of Western culture to the land of Palestine. And alongside all of our efforts to once again settle in the Oriental land and come into friendly contact with the Oriental neighbors, we will preserve the eternal contact with the centers of Western culture. The Mediterranean Sea will be a bridge to the culture of the West, of Europe and America, and to the great centers of the Jewish diaspora." In sum, the call to leave Europe and head eastward was not a call to abandon Europe. The alternatives that were offered to European culture were taken from a repertoire of models drawn from the world of European thought and from the European reality. The return to Oriental land of their fathers was not intended to rid Jews of the Europeanness that clung to them, but to enable them to be European Jews by choice. This was considered a necessary condition for the success of the Zionist enterprise and for the creation of a modern national Hebrew culture. External European characteristics, suits, coffee houses, the opera, and the like, became cultural norms. Rather than a longing for a utopian Orient, Jews expressed fear of what were described as exilic values, the Levantinization of the society and culture, and the renunciation of the European heritage and its valuable assets. Thank you.
Mr. Ascher?
Yeah. Oh, let me take this.
Thank you. Perfect. 14.
First of all, let me thank you for inviting me to this event. I'm particularly pleased to be here to honor Walter Laqueur because I suspect that I'm the only one of two people in this room whose acquaintance with Walter goes back to the 1930s in Breslau, where both of us were born. I don't think we ever said much to each other. I don't think we ever said much to each other at that time, and I'm not even certain that we actually were introduced to each other. Walter was then, and he still is, 7.5 years older than I am. And boys of 10 and 17 don't have much in common. But one of my brothers, Max, 6 years older than I, was part of Walter's circle of friends and a member of the group of which he was the leader, Walter, that is. Both of them left for Palestine, Walter in November 1938 and Max in March 1939. And they remained in close touch for some time. I once saw some letters Motke, Max, wrote in the years from 39 to 41, and I recall that he referred to you, Walter, as Lacqueur, your nickname at that time. Walter and I held our first conversation after the war, in 1957 or 1958, when I was working in Washington, and he paid a visit, I think it was your first, to the United States. I recall that we met at an inexpensive cafe for an inexpensive meal, which is all we could afford at that time. We have been good friends ever since, and in many ways our friendship has grown closer over the years. I've kept up with his work and have read just about all of his articles and certainly all his books. Good friend that he is, he sends me copies of his books, which I very much appreciate because I found this work extremely interesting and insightful. His analyses and conclusions about the great issues of our day always struck me as judicious and thoughtful. But there was a small drawback to his generosity. He became so amazingly productive that a few years ago, I had to call in a carpenter to build a new bookcase in our dining room to accommodate his work. I never discard his books. I can't resist another personal comment, because it also reflects directly on what people think of Walter. In 1978, my wife was being interviewed for a position as editor of the American Journal of International Law. The interviewers were Lou Henkin and Oscar Schachter, highly distinguished professors at Columbia University. Both were very impressed with her and wanted to offer her the job. But they noticed that she had a letter of recommendation from Walter, for whom she had edited for some time. Lou Henkin became hesitant because he was sure that anyone who had worked for Lacqueur would be bored working on their journal. We were putting our children through college and we needed desperately the extra income, so my wife assured them that this would not be the case. She got the job and she has held it for 32 years, including now. Now, I became a historian of Russia and especially appreciated Walter's many contributions to Russian and Eastern European studies. Before I mention his own writings, I should point out, as some others have already, that he was the founder in 1955 and the editor for several years of Survey, a journal of Soviet and East European studies. No one with a serious interest in communism at the time, then a major force in Europe and elsewhere, could afford to ignore it. It was founded at a time when the Cold War was at its height, and when political passions ran high, and yet that journal never became propagandistic. It certainly did not ring the glories of the Soviet Union and its system of rule, but the articles were invariably scholarly and fair-minded. Over the years, many of the leading scholars in the field in the West wrote for it. Let me name just a few to give you an idea what it was like, what this journal amounted to. There was Leonard Shapiro, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Adam Ulam, Robert Conquest, as well as a number of the most distinguished Soviet dissidents, among them, later on, Solzhenitsyn. Even today, students of European history of the post-World War I era regularly turn to this journal for informative studies on a variety of subjects. The same continued with the Journal of Contemporary History, which was Walter also helped found, and which carried many excellent articles on Eastern Europe. He gave up the editorship a few years ago, but it is still doing very well under the distinguished editorship of Stanley Payne and Richard Evans at Cambridge. Now, in this short talk, I cannot possibly do justice to all of Walter's writings on Russia. His, I think, 9 books and many articles in the field cover a wide range of subjects, and all still deserve to be read. In one widely acclaimed book, which has been mentioned earlier, Russia and Germany, he dealt with the often stormy intellectual contacts between Germans and Russians, a subject he rightly considered important because it was a critical factor in the political relations between two powerful countries that have been decisive in determining the course of politics throughout Europe, especially in the 20th century. Walter's interesting thesis in that book is that for centuries those two countries misunderstood each other, and this in turn was a cause for much friction. One of the most original sections of the book, which I think was also mentioned earlier, based heavily on captured German documents, demonstrates that some of the roots of Nazism, the hatred of Russia, communism, and hatred of the Jews, can be traced to Germans who had been influenced by fanatical extremists among the Russian emigres who had left their country after the revolution of 1917. This is now widely accepted by historians, but it was not well known when the book was published in 1965. The Fate of the Revolution, published in 1967, was one of the first to analyze the interpretations of the upheaval that occurred in 1917 and that was so unsettling for much of the world. One of the great virtues of these books is that they are written in clear English, comprehensible to any educated person. Don't look for Foucauldian mystifications in Walter's writings or obscure theorizing that only a few academics claim to understand. Walter writes clearly, he marshals his facts, and then reaches conclusions that follow from them. Common sense, not preconceived notions, guide him in his writings, which is why his work is widely read in this country and in numerous countries around the world. Now, rather than attempt to discuss in detail Walter's many other writings on Russia, I'd like to focus on one article that was briefly mentioned today that demonstrates his approach to politics and that may have received more attention and probably provoked more controversies than any of his other works on Eastern Europe. It is also very revealing of his political values. I'm referring to his article on Finlandization, which appeared in December 1977. The article is intrinsically interesting and important, but it is also noteworthy because it indicated how far Walter had traveled intellectually and politically since the late 1930s. As Walter acknowledged in his autobiography, as a young man in Palestine, he was very much influenced, under the influence of Marxism. He had read many of Marx's works while still in Germany, in Breslau, and that he was attracted by the idealism of the heroes of the Soviet novels. But even then, he had some doubts. He was uncomfortable about the Stalin cult, and even more by the fact that the Soviet regime had some disturbing similarities with the Nazi rule. Now, in his article on Finlandization, Walter expressed his unease over the influence that the Soviet Union exercised over its small neighbor, Finland. This influence took several forms. The Finns could not oppose any major Soviet foreign policy initiative. Their army was not to be larger than permitted by the Soviet government. The Russians intervened in Finnish politics and insisted on the election of Kekkonen, who as president knew how to be subservient to the Russians. There were other restrictions on what books they could publish, what films they could see, but I won't go into all the details. Walter understood that as a small country neighboring Russia, Finland had to be careful not to offend its leaders, the Soviet leaders. But what troubled Walter was the danger that this sort of Finlandization might spread to other countries in Europe. Remember that this article appeared in the mid-1977, I think, when the Soviet Union was still believed to be a mighty power capable of spreading its influence and undermining the influence of its rival, the United States. In this instance, Walter, as scholar and journalist, made a significant contribution to an important debate on the future of democracy. And it gained tremendous responses, number of responses, from people in Finland and Scandinavian countries, and you can read his response to that in his book, The Political Psychology of Appeasement. And you will see his very skillful rebuttal. He easily won the debate, which was widely reported in the West. I think I probably used up the 12 minutes allotted to me in my talk, so let me end by wishing Walter many happy returns of the day, or, as the Israelis would say, Atbeya V'Yasrim. May you live to 120. And if you continue to be as productive over the next 30 years as you've been, I know that he's just finished another book, I will just have to build another bookcase in our dining room. Thank you.
First, let me thank Professor Perry and the friends and admirers of Walter's who organized this tribute to him. It's, for me, a genuine honor and privilege to be a part of this wonderful celebration of Walter's life and really his magisterial contributions across a variety of academic disciplines and public policy issues. Scholars today researching both terrorism and guerrilla warfare face a daunting challenge. Walter Laqueur. While it would be fatuous to state that Walter has said or written everything that there is to say or write about either of these two phenomena, such a claim is not entirely inaccurate. For nearly 40 years, in a dozen or so books and countless articles and reviews, Walter has indefatigably shed new light on both subjects, while simultaneously dismembering the conventional wisdom and dismantling the latest voguish but substanceless methodological fads. In doing so, Walter has laid claim to having the first or final word, and often both, throughout his long and intellectually luxurious career. A modest sampling of Walter's engagement with these two fields' most pressing policy and intellectual issues would include the fool's errand of divining a universal definition of terrorism, the posited but historically exaggerated invincibility of the postmodern guerrilla, religion's salient role in contemporary terrorism, the nexus of terrorism and technology, the causal link between poverty and terrorism and guerrilla warfare, and finally, whether in fact a war on terrorism can ever be won in any meaningful sense. Walter's prodigious scholarly output is the product not only of his discipline and focus, but significantly also of his personal generosity and kindness, and his fundamentally open and inquiring mind. Most important is Walter's passion as teacher and mentor. He has long enjoyed intellectually close and affectionate relationships with both established and especially younger scholars. Now let me pause for a second. Much has rightly been said this morning about the 100+ books that Walter has written, but what hasn't been mentioned is the exponentially greater number of books that Walter has been midwife to. In countless acknowledgments pages of books throughout the world, one finds Walter's name. And I'll give you a perfect example. Just last week, for my own research, I picked up a book titled The Bergson Boys, published by Syracuse University Press and written by Judith Tyder Baumel. And there, the first person cited and acknowledged for his encouragement, his enthusiasm for her project was Walter, which I don't think is at all atypical. The power of Walter's analysis, clarity of his thinking, and fluidity of his prose is perhaps best encapsulated in the Review of Guerrilla, a historical and critical study that appeared in London Sunday Times in 1976, shortly after its publication. Written by Professor Sir Michael Howard, the world's preeminent military historian and authority on strategy and warfare, it seems now, in retrospect, as the perfect summation of Walter's scholarship and contribution to the literature. This huge and ill-defined subject, Sir Michael wrote, has probably been responsible for more incompetent and unnecessary books than any other outside the field of sociology. It attracts phonies and amateurs as a candle attracts moths. When an experienced historian like Dr. Laqueur announced his intention of tackling it, his admirers could not conceal their qualms. Could even he more than flounder in this Serbonian bog? The answer is that he can and does, with a mixture of massive learning and brisk common sense. Indeed, at the time, most treatments of guerrilla warfare and terrorism were either anecdotal or, if within the academy, uselessly theoretical. Guerrilla was thus a veritable breath of fresh air, and as would characterize all of Walter's subsequent work on these subjects, a useful rejoinder to those lacking the historical perspective necessary to understand events and trends that were neither as new nor unique as the more gullible or parochial believe them to be. The importance of geography to the guerrilla, the timeless demographics and socioeconomic backgrounds of leaders and foot soldiers alike, the serial recurrence of guerrilla warfare in the same countries and regions, the inverse correlation between guerrilla warfare and economic development, along with education and opportunity, were among the preeminent characteristics of this mode of warfare that Walter identified then and which have continued relevance today. His overall pronouncement, given this concatenation of empirical observations, is hardly comforting and not terribly optimistic. Graduates of this school, Walter recently wrote in his own reflections of a career spent studying guerrilla warfare and terrorism, do not become apostles of humanism after victory. It is though in the study of terrorism where Walter has both had the greatest influence and indisputably established his lasting legacy. Not surprising, perhaps, is that the springboard for these scholarly inquiries was doubtless the academic course on terrorism that Walter conceived and taught at Georgetown University in the early 1970s, the first to be offered at a university in the United States. Walter brought a unique sobriety and clarity to the study of this often visceral, febrile subject. In both editions of his monumental work, Terrorism and the Age of Terrorism, he urged scholars to move beyond the paralytic attempts to define terrorism, arguing that it was neither possible nor really worthwhile to try to do so. Walter was equally energetic and persuasive in his debunking of theories about poverty, lack of education, and unemployment as explanations for the eruption of terrorism. He has repeatedly pointed out that both the historical and contemporary empirical evidence fail to support such sweeping claims, devastatingly observing that in the 49 countries currently designated by the United Nations as the least developed, hardly any terrorist activity occurs. For this reason, unlike many analysts and commentators who were shocked that Umar Farouk Abdulmutallab, the Christmas Day 2009 would-be bomber, was well-educated and from a wealthy family, Walter was not. Similarly, when many expressed the same surprise when in May 2010, Faisal Shahzad was apprehended after attempting to detonate a vehicular bomb in New York City's Times Square, and it was found that he held a bachelor's degree in science, a bachelor's of science degree in computing, and a master's of business administration, Walter was not surprised either. As he had correctly explained 7 years before, for terrorists to survive, much less thrive in today's globalized, technologically savvy, and interconnected world, they have to be, quote, educated, have some technical competence, and be able to move without attracting attention in alien societies. In brief, such a person will have to have an education that cannot be found among the poor in Pakistani or Egyptian villages or Palestinian refugee camps, only among relatively well-off townfolk, close quote. In his seminal 1996 Foreign Affairs article titled Postmodern Terrorism, Walter rightly argued that we were on the cusp of a new era of terrorism for a new century. Religious imperatives and theological justifications, and perhaps even the use of weapons of mass destruction, he wrote, would usher in a new wave of terrorist violence, even bloodier and more destructive than before. All of Walter's arguments and conclusions presented in this brief essay attest to the fact that both guerrilla warfare and terrorism are timeless phenomena that cannot be forcibly eradicated, decisively defeated in conventional military terms, or simplistically solved. Recognition of their intractability and appreciation of their complexities are thus essential first steps in managing these two particular forms of conflict. There can be no victory, only an uphill struggle, Walter wisely counsels us, at times successful, at other times not. Nearly 10 years into the war on terrorism, this is not necessarily what many Americans wish to hear, but it's perhaps what they need to hear. As with everything that he studies, Walter looks at the world, looks at the world as it is, and not as one might wish it to be. Incisive analysis, based on the cumulative process of acquiring knowledge and then weighing the empirical evidence, remains at the heart of Walter's approach, which is why, on guerrilla warfare and terrorism at least, he is as close to an oracle as any of us here are likely ever to be. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, unluckily for me, but perhaps luckily for you, I've left most of my notes at home. So we'll see how well I can improvise. Without my glasses. Now, there's one personal thing involved, which is when I turned about 19, I was agonizing over what I might do with the rest of my life. I consulted an eminent Israeli medievalist. And he thought for a little while and then said, well, you would live the life of a Walter Laqueur. And I was familiar with the name. I had been acquainted with regular essays published in the Hebrew language under his impossibly spelled name in Hebrew, incidentally, that made sure no Israelis would ever know how to pronounce it. Published regularly at the time in a newspaper of the urban middle class, Ma'ariv, that has suffered a great decline since then. And I was certainly familiar with that oracle of my Friday afternoons. I hesitated a little while, and finally I said to the professor, well, I can't really aspire to live his life, but let me make a commitment to you. I would make a presentation on his 90th birthday. And look how prophetic I was. Now, one of the most intriguing Google-related activities is, at least in my case, somewhat peculiar, I admit, is to search Walter Laqueur's name in exotic contexts. Now let's see how many returns might he generate in simplified Mandarin, or Korean, or Burmese. Well, not in Burmese, or thanks to the new availability of an adequate iPhone keyboard in Cherokee. There is little doubt that Professor Laqueur's writings have informed East Asians on fascism, Russians on anti-Semitism, South Americans on Zionism, Indians and Pakistanis on terrorism, and needless to say, Europeans on Europe's past and future. Especially rewarding is looking him up in books which have absolutely nothing to do with his writings and special interests, or ostensibly nothing to do. Now, you would know why he is in a book called Poetics of Fascism, or Jews and Messianism in the Modern Era, or a historical dictionary of Germany's Weimar Republic, or Russia's in 19th century. But what business does he have being in a 2009 book named Cookies, Coleslaw, Stoops, Influence of Dutch on North American Languages? Now, I bet you Walter himself might have a hard time figuring this out. Well, in a chapter of the book called Dutch Loanwords That Did Not Originate from Immigrants, the author tells us that around 1980, the Dutch recalcitrance over the deployment of American nuclear missiles in Western Europe spawned the contemptuous term Hollanditis, or Dutch disease. The word Hollanditis was coined by the well-known commentator Walter Laqueur in his 1981 article, Hollanditis, A New Stage in European Neutralism. Now, isn't it fun? I don't know that Professor Laqueur would match Thomas Carlyle's tongue-in-cheek description of Jean-Paul Richter, a German romantic writer whom he much admired, who, Master Carlyle said, was blessed with astonishing liberality in parentheses, dashes, and subsidiary clauses, invented hundreds of new words, altered old ones, or by hyphen, chains and pairs and packs them together into most jarring combination. Now, I don't know that Walter Laqueur would claim hundreds of new words, though some terms have been attributed to him that he never claimed. Hollanditis is his, all right. But Finlandization was not quite, even though an essay he wrote in 1977, as we have heard from Professor Ascher, helped popularize that very chilling concept of a small nation trading some of its liberties in exchange for a license to exercise some others. And I can tell you, I was but a late teenager at the time the 1977 essay came out, and it was all the rage. There was hardly any commentary on international affairs that didn't quote it. And no one really asked where it came from, or where that discussion originated from. Only years later, I found out who the originator was. Now, what caught my eye in the Dutch language book was the characterization of Professor Laqueur, not professor, not scholar, not historian, not author, rather well-known commentator, which indeed he is. He has been commenting now for almost 70 years. It is doubtful that any president would nominate him for any job which requires Senate hearing, for he has left a long tail of opinions in his wake. We know how Washington turned a family name into a verb, to be balked, as in the name of Judge Bork, the would-be justice of the Supreme Court, if only he had kept quiet in the preceding 30 years. But I can easily imagine the same done to Laqueur, and people saying, he was Laqueured. Now, not least because of his incriminating past. I may break the news to you today, but it is entirely thanks to his socialist, collectivist idealism that he became a prominent Russia expert. How so? Because he idealized Stalin? Not quite. He worked diligently in a kibbutz, had an accident, broke his leg, was grounded for half a year, had the merciful attention of a Russian-speaking neighbor who introduced him initially to Pravda in Izvestia and eventually to Pushkin. If only all practitioners of labor Zionism had that kind of luck. Mind you, when Senator Jesse Helms found out years later of Walter's communist past, he expressed strong misgivings about his influence over the nation's way of thinking. Now, where in the spectrum of politics does he stand? It's certainly a question that bedeviled me from time to time. That Walter Laqueur, that communist, that neoconservative, that cold warrior, that detractor of the Vietnam War, that ardent Zionist, that advocate of a binational state, where does he belong? A minor reviewer, kind of leftish, grilled Walter Laqueur recently and believed himself to push the dagger particularly deep in turning Laqueur's self-labeling against him. How dare Laqueur portray himself as, quote, a person of the center-left, unquote, and how dare he assert that, quote, in most ways, I continue to do so. How could a center-left person, asked the reviewer, single out for praise the likes of Irving Kristol, Bernard Lewis, Henry Kissinger, while, quote, reviling, unquote, Hannah Arendt, Michel Foucault, Eric Hobsbawm? Oh dear. How indeed can one live through most of the 20th century, engage in most of its polemical battles, stand in what Lionel Trilling called the Bloody Crossroad in which politics and literature meet, and yet not become a doctrinaire, not substitute forgiving irony for dark sarcasm? 1949 was a pivotal year in a young man's state of mind. It was time to choose. In Paris, Jean-Paul Sartre let know that, quote, one must choose between the USSR and the Anglo-Saxon bloc, unquote. Closer to home, where Walter was at that time, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion was busy rebuffing a challenge that would sound to you a science fiction, rebuffing a challenge from the radical Zionist left, which had just won 6th of all Knesset seats. It was led by the party, which incidentally had paid Walter Laqueur's salary in the preceding few years, as he was a reporter for its mouthpiece, Al HaMishmar, translated into Hebrew as, or into English rather, as The Guardian. They told Ben-Gurion in a famous, even at the time famous, though by now largely forgotten, meeting in Tel Aviv, that it was time to orient Israel's foreign policy toward the world of tomorrow. One of the attendants was a future highly influential member of Golda Meir's inner cabinet, even told Ben-Gurion that the United States was the slaving plantation of the world, 1949. And Ben-Gurion, as a result, delivered a speech full of veiled references in which he said it was time to choose between Zion and the golden calf, Zion or Egel HaZahav. And certainly Walter Laqueur made the choice, even though ironically, in order to choose Zion, he left Zion and moved to the Anglo-Saxon world, transcending the Atlantic, and becoming in many respects an heir to the mantle of another Walter, who left an extraordinary mark on the first half of the 20th century and the state of mind of people from both sides of the Atlantic. That was Walter Lippmann, who wrote in 1942, "We cannot betray the Atlantic community by submitting. What we must fight for is the common interest of the Western world, for the integrity of the Atlantic powers. We must recognize that we are in fact one great community and act as members of it." Walter Lippmann was a journalist. Walter Laqueur has been so much more, but certainly a journalist as well. And even though Mark Bloch has the vignette in his last book, I think, The Graft of Historians, about an exchange he had with a very old person who had the recollection of the revolutionary events of 1830 in France. And he said, well, nothing has happened since in historical terms. There has been no history since 1830. There's been only politics. And Mark Bloch says, well, making it more comprehensible to people who lived in the late 1930s, he said, now we would say, there is no history, it's all journalism. So I come from to you from a despised profession, but I bear that label with some honor and dignity, and certainly happy that I have the opportunity to share it with Walter Laqueur, who, as I certainly come to the close of my remarks, just I'm on a commission from New England Press, and I failed to see the pile of books that we have asked to be piled outside with Walter's breathtaking intellectual autobiography, Best of Times, Worst of Times. And what intrigues me repeatedly is his effortless elegance with prose. And my inconsequential favorite is this, in which he describes one of his Austrian partners in the Congress for Cultural Freedom. That was Frederick Torborg, a very gifted satirist, but a loose cannon. Torborg was also a quarrelsome man. One of his few friendships that lasted was with Marlene Dietrich, who called him from Paris whenever she felt lonely and unhappy, which was quite often. He was also the author of one of the great sport novels in the history of literature, Die Mannschaft, about a water polo team. And as a very young man, he had written an astonishingly mature novel about the suicide of a high school student. With all his talents, he was an embarrassment for the Congress. He wanted, for instance, to ban Bertolt Brecht's plays in Austria. I owe him an enormous debt of gratitude, however, for introducing me to Vienna's leading coffee house, Café Demmel. Without this introduction, I would probably have been treated much less politely. And this book is replete with paragraphs like this, which leave you really wanting for so much more. Now, my final paragraph, in the 1960s, people used to say in Paris, better to be wrong with Sartre than be right with Aron, Ramon Aron. Well, better be right with Walter Laqueur, and I hereby confess, even better be wrong with him, because it's so interesting. I would like to commend with great admiration a leading partner in the Laqueur endeavor, his wife Susie, a lady of great beauty, subtlety, profundity, and compassion. And I reminding you that we are all having a rendezvous here in May 2020.
Well, thank you to all the panelists who not only shared some wonderful reflections and insights of their own about the areas of Walter's intellectual interest, but were remarkably disciplined in their presentation. So we do have a half an hour. A couple of just general reflections is, Walter, I think Walter's career has showed that you can write about deep ideological phenomenon in a non-ideological way. I love some of the vignettes that we've heard about the mystery of his own political journeys and his own political evolution, keeping people guessing. And what a wonderful multicultural life he has lived, understanding so many different places and their history and their particularities and peculiarities, and sharing them with all of us. So I'm going to invite you all to share your own thoughts, ask a question to any of the panelists. I'd ask that you identify yourself, and if you'd like to address your question to a particular panelist, please indicate so. Please, in the front row.
I'm Charles Mayer, historian. Plus a question. I would like to first put one book on the table, one of the 100 plus that have, you probably have in your bookshelves already, I'm sure. This was Weimar Culture, which was an extraordinarily trenchant and way of exploring and getting to the essence of that rather tortured experiment in brief compass, and it made a great impression on us as men studying German history. The first thing I ever published, in fact, I published in an early issue of the Journal of Contemporary History, and it was a great treat with George Mossy, whom I've actually knew personally more closely and better, and I won't claim any real personal acquaintance with Walter. I would say, but he's certainly a presence, and I lived on Central Park for 9 years, actually. I was 0 to 9, so I don't think I was responsible for some of the thought. And this was before the New York Review books. And those of us who were younger at the time and sort of in a centrist position, I think the Congress of Cultural Freedom, I discussed this often with Dan Bell, it had wonderful intellectuals. It told things that had to be said. I think what disturbed many of us who were younger then was the fact that the way it was funded and had to be funded. But this is Walter. I'm I'd say sort of a left centrist. He describes himself that way. I'm probably more to the left, more sentimental in some respects. But this is what I valued about him. There's an Italian word, spregiudicato, which means, in a sense, unprejudiced, clear-minded, but also tough-minded. And this is the adjective I would use for him. And what I get out of reading him is, in a sense, a voice which always says, I think, as others have said, just think, Charles, you may be wrong on that issue. And this is a very good reminder to have, even when you don't agree with somebody. Because the voice is not so far distant that it seems hectoring, and it's not so far distant that it seems at odds. It's just a voice of warning that the world is complicated, and sometimes people are not as nice as one would wish, and others. And I think this, sir, is what I've taken away from your work.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Ms. Hoffman. Well, first of all, the panel, thanks for your very astute comments and everything. But I'd like to ask Ms. Hoffman if you had some thoughts about the connection between Walter's historiography of fascism and National Socialism, his interpretation of that, and how that influences his interpretations and analysis of terrorism.
It's actually a very, very good question, and I think it illustrates the continuum of Walter's work and ideological thinking, and perhaps why, unlike many others, he was able to approach the study of terrorism with this, foresight and tremendous clarity from his experiences, and also study other forms of political violence or political movements that preached violence, that sought to achieve their ends through intolerance as well. So I think that there's certainly a connection. One of the most important contributions that I think I perhaps only too implicitly alluded to in my talk is that really for so long, until Walter, there was really a vacuum of the historical understanding of terrorism. And indeed, one can see today that there's probably a generation that believes the terrorist phenomena commenced on September 11th, 2001, and that there's nothing that history or the past has to tell us. And that's why Terrorism and the Age of Terrorism were two such important books, I think, because of his ability to go back in time and illustrate not only the fact that it was a timeless phenomena, but to link it as an offshoot or as a derivation of broader political movements, and terrorism itself as being a manifestation of perhaps the desperate and perhaps the most attention-seeking, and also to, I think, quite cogently depict its inhumanity.
Yes, in the back. I'm sorry, could you repeat?
Where in Palestine did Dr. Laqueur and
Can you answer that for us, Yoav?
Where in Palestine?
Walter, in Palestine? And yourself as well.
All over Palestine, from a kibbutz in the Lower Galilee to an Arab village outside of Jerusalem, to the neighborhood of Rehavia in Jerusalem, of which he relates at great length in a biography of Jerusalem called Dying for Jerusalem. We are talking about the period of November 1938, I suppose, altogether to 1954. But later on, when Walter became a visiting professor at Tel Aviv University in the 1960s, he lived in the Tel Aviv area for a few years. Hope that is addressing the question.
And how formative was that, you say?
How
How much did it contribute to forming
How formative was that experience?
How formative? Well, as formative as any experience that a 17-year-old boy just separated from his parents, never to see them again, could have. I related anecdotally the vignette of him breaking a leg while working in a kibbutz, which opened the gate to him and to the world, for that matter, to his specialty in all Russian affairs. He tried his best also in Arabic, having lived in an Arab environment outside of Jerusalem, but as he modestly comments, I guess that's an inherent modesty of a native of Middle Europa, that he's not good with languages. So he didn't manage to develop his Arabic skills. But I strongly suggest to you, go back to Dying for Jerusalem, and you'll figure out how terribly formative it was. Walking through the landscape of tiny, somewhat provincial, imbued with academic life, Jerusalem of the early 1940s, reporting the War of Independence from a besieged Jerusalem, following, even earlier, following various UN delegates over the entire space of Palestine, trying to figure out what solution they might be able to generate judging simply by the abundance of references Walter has made to those years in pre-independence Palestine, then post-independence Israel, one is free to assume that it was highly formative. And finally, he gave Israel that gift, that great gift on its 60th birthday, the absolutely brilliant and entirely incomprehensible to me counterfactual about a Jewish, well, about a multinational state with a Jewish plurality coming to being in the first half of the 19th century that stretches all the way from the Mediterranean to the Euphrates and beyond, which has doesn't have a numerical dominance of Jews, but has so many Jews in it. And no one quite managed to figure out what he meant by that. It was published by Middle East Center at Harvard by no other than Martin Kramer, who may be known to some of you not to harbor leftish or revisionist sentiments about Zionism. And he loved it, only he said at the footnotes that he's quite comfortable with what Israel has actually become. But you go and visit that extraordinary exercise in a preemptive Judenstadt. Walter Laqueur once intimated that if he had to choose a period to live in, he would live in Paris of the late 19th century. I guess that would have made him old enough to travel Palestine in the 1840s and view firsthand the establishment of what Martin Kramer, with a twist of irony, called Disraelia, because there was no Herzl there. There was a Benjamin Disraeli, a frustrated and defeated Tory politician in Britain who initiates the establishment of that huge Commonwealth. So Walter is describing the Israelia much like Herzl described the Judenstadt. And since Walter is a biographer and a certified biographer of Zionism, still probably the most prominent biographer of Zionism of any, we should all go and see what the world would have looked like, if only.
In a few minutes, we'll be handing the mic to Walter so he can answer any of these questions in case there are any inaccuracies here, or if he wants to add some additional thoughts. Any other questions or comments?
Can we?
Well, then I think, Walter, would you like to stay there? I can bring you the mic. Yes. I think I can bring you the mic. Here we go.
Let's turn the chair around.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, having listened to the description of all the things which I have done right, of course it occurred to me what have I done wrong. It's not a subject I like to talk about in public, but if I think back, I certainly did, as a historian, I underrated the impact of religion, and to a certain extent of nationalism. Then, as a political commentator, I made often the mistake, which others did too. I realized a certain political trend was emerging. And having realized that, I thought that it would unfold in the near future. But in real life, there are always retarding circumstances, and things take much longer than one assumes. Now, people have very kindly talked about the number of my books, which reminded me of my first visit to the United States. I was invited by the Harvard Russian Research Center, then in Dunster Street, and the Middle Eastern Center. And I shared a room with an old and very experienced history professor. And he said, Walter, what's the hurry? You never understand America. If you write one book, you're all right. If you write 2 books, you're a genius. If you write 3 books, you're a charlatan. So what's the hurry? I face here a certain problem, namely at a certain age, having reached a certain age, I decided never again to talk in public. I didn't like it, I wasn't particularly good at it, and today I face a real dilemma. What is the dilemma? The dilemma is that I have an obligation, having listened to all the nice things. On the other hand, I want to stick to my principles. So an idea occurred to me. I won't give a speech. I will sing a song. And I had a specific song in mind. There is a German composer whose music I don't particularly like. His politics I detest. It's Richard Wagner. However, Richard Wagner wrote one opera which I do like, namely The Master Singers of Nuremberg. And this opera is devoted to a large extent to one historical figure by the name of Hans Sachs, who lived in the first half of the 16th century and was a famous poet. He wrote not less than 6,000 pieces of poems, of essays, of religious literature. So my modest 142 compared to Hans Sachs are nothing. Now, in this opera, the public is very respectful, and they say, Hans Sachs, you are the greatest, and you are the pride of our country, and you are wonderful. And then, of course, Hans Sachs has to answer. And it was not easy, so he sings for 2 minutes, and then he begins his famous aria, in which he said, it's easy for you, it's difficult for me, far too much honor for a poor man. That would have been my aria, except the orchestra didn't turn up. Hans Sachs is a bass baritone, I'm not. And certainly, having listened to all these wonderful things, how could I inflict my voice on you? Thank you.
Well, with that, we conclude the wonderful event. I thank you very much for all of you for coming. I thank the panelists for coming, sharing their opinions and beliefs, ideas, thoughts, knowledge with us. And we are not going to meet when Walter will be 120. We're going to meet again in 10 years when he's 100 years old. Thank you.
Okay.
So tell me about the foundation.
The foundation is a very large foundation that tries to keep under the radar.
Very nice. Yes, it was
No, it's well, the foundation is located in Cleveland.
How do you do?
I'm in Boston.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
But it has very large enterprises in Israel, higher education, humanity.